But it's not all good news for Netflix, as the company's transgender employees and their allies plan to walk out today in protest of the release of comedian Dave Chappelle's most recent stand-up comedy special. Outrage erupted after the release of the comedian's sixth Netflix special, The Closer, with activists calling Chappelle's jokes about transgender people offensive. The company's chief executive supported carrying the special on the platform, citing a commitment to creative freedom. But now co-chief executive Ted Sarandos is walking back those claims, saying that he, quote, screwed up in his efforts to communicate with upset employees. So NPR TV critic Eric Deggans wrote about Chappelle's special and is here to discuss. And I do want to point out another thing. You know, the trans employees from Netflix and non-binary employees that plan on walking out, they did release a list of demands. And none of them actually include pulling Dave Chappelle's special. They talked a lot about encouraging trans creatives, those working within the company. They talked a lot about the positive things that Netflix could do to bolster this community, and not about, you know, cancel Dave Chappelle. I just want to put that out there. But you waded into those waters. Yes, you did. For those who have not seen the special yet, can you just give us some background on it and the backlash that has followed?
Sure. So this special was Chappelle's sixth special for Netflix, and the last one in a mega deal that he cut with them that led to him being paid, several millions of dollars. And in this special, he cracks a lot of jokes about feminism, about gay people, about transgender people. And at the core of many of those jokes, the ideas that he advanced seem rooted in homophobia and transphobia in particular, and insisting that gender is fact, aligning himself with a type of feminist that denies that trans women are women, centering jokes on the idea that for a trans woman to claim to be a woman, that would be silly or that would be absurd. You know, the list goes on and on. You know, he seemed to try and find every sort of button pushing stance that he could take, particularly on gay people and transgender people, and put them in the special. And because he's such a great comedian, of course, it's very funny and, it's very compelling. But the ideas at the heart of most of these jokes are really unfortunate, and they encourage a lot of prejudices, stereotypes, and I think damaging ideas about gay people and transgender people, especially.
Eric, I'm so glad you're on to talk to us about this, because I really found your review of the special incredibly compelling. And one of the points that you make is that in the mind of Dave Chappelle, as you see it as a critic, race trumps all. And I want to read specifically something that you said, which stood out to me as incredibly interesting and powerful. And Anne-Marie and I were talking about it the day after you posted this review. You write this. The Dave Chappelle assumes that the struggle, I'm quoting you now, over oppression is a zero-sum game. That because some gay people have access to white privilege in America, all of their concerns about stereotyping and marginalization are hollow and subordinate to what black people face. Unwrap that for our audience. Explain what you were trying to say there.
Sure. So there's several instances where Dave Chappelle talks about, at one point he talks about being jealous of gay people because he feels like the gay rights movement has moved faster than the civil rights movement for black people. And then at one point he talks about almost getting in a fight with a gay man, and that gay man calling the police, and him saying that he was accessing his white privilege by calling the police, knowing that the police might take his side once they show up. And the point I was trying to make is that comparing oppressions, number one, is always a terrible idea. The only people who win when you do that are the people who benefit from systemic racism and oppression, because marginalized groups are fighting each other instead of fighting the system. And I think it's unfortunate when you get in this situation where people are sort of looking at other groups and saying, well, that group did better or that group did better. Of course, there are some racist gay people, just like there are some racist people in every group. And of course, there are some gay people who have access to white privilege, but there are a lot of gay people who don't. And simply because there are some people who can access that, that doesn't mean that their ideas and perceptions and the reality of their oppression somehow is invalidated or is somehow subordinate to what Black people go through. If anything, we should be able to relate to each other as members of marginalized groups when our oppression is similar, and we should be sympathetic when our oppression is different. And that's not what he's doing here, and it's really quite disturbing.
So kind of the counter argument to this. Dave Chappelle's a comedian. He cracks a joke kind of at the beginning of the special about Jewish people, and the audience kind of groans. The audience is kind of uncomfortable, and he goes, well, there's a lot more of that coming. That's not exactly what he said, but he basically says, warning ya, this is what I'm doing for the next hour. Right? I'm going to hit like the Culture War's greatest hits, and if you are feeling warm now, you're going to be burning by the end of this special. That's what he does. I'm going to say something that might get me canceled. I was never that crazy about his show. Perhaps because there's a lot of sexist humor in it, and it didn't really do anything for me. But a lot of people love that show. I thought it was legendary.
Glad you asked the next question.
So there you go, right? So you get my point is, maybe he's not to your taste. I watched the special. I found some things offensive and not funny. I found some things offensive and hilarious, and I found some things inoffensive and absolutely hilarious. It just is what comedians do. Why are we acting shocked? That's the counter argument.
Well, I mean, if that were true, then, talented comedians who told racist jokes, we wouldn't object to them either. The point of fact is, what Dave Chappelle is asking for is the ability to make the kind of jokes rooted in homophobia and transphobia that he would never accept if a white comedian were making similar jokes rooted in racism. But beyond that, Dave Chappelle doesn't earn $20 million per comedy special just because he's a great comedian. He's considered to be a thought leader in comedy and in social issues. People loved Chappelle's show because it said really poignant truths, important truths about life and race and society. They enjoyed the comedy, but they also enjoyed the fact that they were getting a higher message. They were getting a more substantive message. And I think he's expanded upon that as a stand-up comic. And that's one reason why he's considered one of the greatest stand-up comics of all time. And I wouldn't dispute that. But when you put that talent to work, making people laugh about jokes that deny the essential truth that oppressed people face. That's one of the things that's unfortunate about his stand-up, about the closer, is that, transgender women are saying we're women too. He's making jokes rooted in the idea that, no, you are not women. I'm denying this truth that you are bringing as an oppressed person, as a marginalized person. And as Black people, we know how painful that is for us to stand up and say, systemic racism is an issue in our lives. Police are killing us at rates that cannot be tolerated. We don't have access to society in the way that some other groups do. And then to have a member of another group come to us and say, well, that's not true. Oh, well, you don't have it right. We know that pain. So I find it kind of shocking and bewildering that a comic who is so sensitive and perceptive about race would do these kinds of things to another marginalized group.
So, Eric, and the reason I think what you're saying is important, and I'm glad we're having this conversation, and I'm glad you're sharing your thoughts with our audience, is because there will be some people who will say, people today are just so sensitive. Nobody can joke about anything. Nobody can do comedy. I am a huge, just like Mr. Sarandos, who's the CEO of Netflix, he's a huge comedy fan, right? I am a huge comedy fan. I've listened to those early underground Red Fox records from the 1950s and Lenny Bruce's stuff from the 1960s that got him thrown into jail. I love Richard Pryor. Right? I mean, the stand-up comedians have always been under fire. And that was sort of what Anne-Marie and I were talking about earlier, which is, stand-up comedy is about pissing people off. But you also point out something that's important, which is that that these statements that he makes in his special are about keeping, and this is, again, I'm quoting you, keeping the anger and prejudice behind those words, behind Chappelle's words, from becoming widely acceptable or turning into action. So the question becomes, and I haven't watched the special because Anne-Marie and I were talking about this, and I said, I don't want to watch it. Listening to Eric and others who've written about it, it doesn't sound like it's something for me as much as I love Dave Chappelle's comedy. This doesn't sound like it's for me. Other critics have argued, no, you need to watch it because just saying, as I did, comedians should not be censored, comedians should not be canceled. You need to understand the full scope of what he said for you to be able to then do your job as a journalist to talk about it on the air or write about it. So how critical is it that somebody needs to watch and listen to everything that Chappelle says to be able to come up with an understanding of it? And maybe this notion of comedians just doing comedy doesn't stand if you take the full scope of his words.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there in what you asked. I guess what I would say is I'm a big believer in not judging something until a piece of work until you've experienced it. So if somebody wants to know whether or not how they should feel about this, ultimately, I guess they should watch it. I'm hesitant to reward Netflix and to reward Dave Chappelle with views just because the special has become controversial and you have all these people who may not agree with what Dave Chappelle is saying watching it just to see exactly what he's saying. That bothers me. But I do think it's important not to condemn something until you've actually experienced it and you know exactly what you're condemning. If you have a sensitive, maybe too traumatic, or maybe something that you don't want to subject yourself to, then certainly don't do it.
But what about the flip side to that?
I think it's important to give him a listen if you want to know what it's like.
But what the flip side is, if someone hasn't listened to it and they see the headlines or they read your review and they say, you know what, comedians should be able to do comedy. People are saying, no, you need to watch it, and then maybe you won't feel like that afterwards. It's sort of the flip. Not that you don't watch it and then you condemn it without watching it, but that you condemn it because you believe of a comedian's right to be able to do comedy no matter what he says or what she says. Well,
first of all, nobody's, as you guys pointed out earlier, nobody's saying that Dave Chappelle shouldn't be able to do comedy. I didn't say in my piece that the closer should be pulled off of Netflix. But I do feel like there are a lot of people who are watching that. I can tell from the response that I've gotten to my column, there are a lot of people who are watching that who refuse to believe that he's saying what he's saying. And that's what I want people to do, is to face the truth of what he's saying. And if you can face the truth of what he's saying and still watch it, and still hold him up as an exemplar of comedy, go right ahead. But do it with your eyes open and do it with the idea that you know what you're co-signing. And I also think it's important that we have a debate. One of the things that also bothered me about the special was that Dave Chappelle cracked several jokes where he resisted the idea of people coming up to him and trying to talk to him about the impact of his jokes and trying to talk to him about, how what he was saying was impacting their lives out in the world. And I don't know how you do a special like this where you put all of these complicated button-pushing ideas out there and then not have a conversation. To me, that's like the whole point of this. And so there's so much about this that just doesn't make sense to me and is unfortunate. And ultimately, I'm hoping a talent like Chappelle will listen to a bit of this criticism and maybe think about it and maybe do something different when his next special comes out.
Yeah. Eric, I think that's sort of the irony of the special, is that it's a response to all his critics while he's saying, "How dare you criticize me?" Right? But he's getting a lot of raw material out of those critics. But I was going to say that I think that's the thing about your review or your criticism that I think really sparked an interest in Vlad, and he forwarded it to me, is that what you are asking people to do is not watch it passively, but be a thinking person when you consume this stuff, and as opposed to cancel him Like, that's, you're not necessarily saying that. You're just saying, like, think about it. Think about what you're ingesting, what's going into your mind and what's being said.
I'm definitely not saying cancel him. And I also, again, I got the sense in the response that I got from the people responding to the column that a lot of people were saying what they wish he had been saying. they would say, oh, no, what he's saying is this. And then what I would say is, well, here's the joke. Like he, just look at the text. Just look at what he actually said. He's not saying what you wish he would say. He's saying what he wants to say. And if anything, you know, he's been explicit about being disappointed in fans not understanding what he means when he says something. So when he comes out and he says, I'm Team Turf, I take him at his word. You know, when he comes out and he says that he's jealous of gay people because he believes their struggle has progressed faster than Black people's, I take him at his word. You know, when he says something like, comparing, you know, that there's no public response to the baby being involved in an incident where he shot and killed somebody versus hurting gay people's feelings, the way he put it. That's something that is also sad about Black people when we want to assert our civil rights and we want to make sure that racist language is not accepted in television or film, that we don't want our feelings hurt. And we know that if those ideas get accepted, then it's not about hurt feelings. It's about, what does the security guard do when they come across you in a darkened alleyway? How does a cop react when he stops you for a traffic stop? Because he's seen, 10 cop shows that unfairly portray Black people. We know that these ideas can have tangible, dangerous effects for marginalized groups. That's why we speak out against them. And to deny that idea to other marginalized groups because you want to make fun of them, I think, again, is a really disappointing stance to take.
Man, Eric Deggans, we could obviously, spend a half hour chatting with you about this fascinating subject. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm such a fan of your work and your writing that it's just really great for us to hear your perspective on the air. Thank you very much.